Lecture 1. That there is no need of giving many proofs for one problem. Once when discussion turned upon proofs or demonstrations, such as beginners must learn from their teachers of philosophy in gaining a mastery of whatever they are studying, Musonius said that there was no sense in seeking many proofs for each point, but rather cogent and lucid ones. Thus, just as the physician who prescribes many drugs for his patients deserves less praise than the one who succeeds in helping them with a few, so the philosopher who teaches his pupils with the use of many proofs is less effective than the one who leads them to the desired goal with few. And the pupil too, the quicker his intelligence, the fewer proofs he will require, and the sooner he will assent to the conclusion of the argument in question, provided it be sound. But those who require proofs at every point, even where the matter is perfectly clear, or demand to have demonstrated at length things which could be explained briefly, are completely inept and dull-witted. The gods, we may assume, need no proof of anything, inasmuch as nothing to them lacks clearness or is obscure, and it is only in reference to obscurity that there is any need of proof. Man, however, must needs seek to find out that which is not plain nor self-evident through the medium of the plain and obvious. That is the function of proof. Take, for example, the proposition that pleasure is not a good. At first sight, we do not recognize it as true, since in fact pleasure appeals to us as a good. But starting from the generally accepted premise that every good is desirable, and adding to it a second equally accepted that some pleasures are not desirable, we succeed in proving that pleasure is not a good. That is, we prove the unknown or unrecognized by means of the known or recognized. Or again, that toil is not an evil is not on the face of it a persuasive proposition, while its opposite, that toil is an evil, seems much more persuasive. But starting from the known and accepted premise that every evil is a thing to be avoided, and adding to it another obvious one, namely that many forms of toil are not in the category of things to be avoided, we conclude that toil is not an evil. Since this, then, is the nature of proof, when we consider that some men are quicker of wit and others duller, that some are reared in better environment, others in worse, those of the latter class being inferior in character and native disposition will require more proofs and more diligent attention to be led to master the teachings in question and to be moulded by them, just as defensive physiques, when the goal is to restore perfect health, require very diligent and prolonged treatment. On the other hand, such pupils as are of a finer nature and have enjoyed better training will more easily and more quickly, and with few proofs, assent to sound reasoning and put it into practice. How true this is, we may readily recognize if we chance to know two lads or young men, of whom one has been reared in luxury, his body effeminate, his spirit weakened by soft living, and having besides a dull and torpid disposition. The other, reared somewhat in the Spartan manner, unaccustomed to luxury, practised in self-restraint, and ready to listen to sound reasoning. If then we place these two young men in the position of pupils of a philosopher, arguing that death, toil, poverty, and the like are not evils, or again, that life, pleasure, wealth, and the like are not goods, do you imagine that both will give heed to the argument in the same fashion, and that one will be persuaded by it in the same degree as the other? Far from it. The one reluctantly and slowly and fairly pried loose by 1,000 arguments will perhaps in the end give sign of assent. I mean, of course, the dullard. The other quickly and readily will accept the argument as cogent and relevant to himself, and will not require many proofs nor a fuller treatment. Was not just such a lad the Spartan boy who asked, Cleanthes the philosopher if toil was not a good? He made it plain that he was so well endowed by nature and by training for the practice of virtue as to consider toil closer to the nature of good than of evil, in that he asked whether toil was not a perchance a good, as if it were conceded that it was not an evil. Thereupon Cleanthes, in surprise and admiration of the boy, replied, "Thou art of noble blood, dear child, so noble the words thou speakest." Can you doubt that such a lad would have been readily persuaded not to fear poverty, nor death, nor any of the things which seem terrible, and again not to seek after wealth, nor life, nor pleasure? To come back to the starting point of my discussion, I repeat that it is mistaken zeal for the teacher, if he be a true philosopher, to rehearse a multitude of arguments and proofs to his pupils. He should rather touch upon each one with just measure, seek to penetrate to the very intellect of his hearer, and present persuasive arguments and such as cannot easily be refuted. But most of all, his treatment should consist in showing himself not only as one who utters words which are most helpful, but as one who acts consistently with them. As for the pupil, it is his duty to attend diligently to what is said, and to be on his guard lest he accept it unwittingly something false. But what if he accepts as truth? His effort should not be directed toward learning numbers of proofs, far from it, but only such as are plain and lucid. Finally, whatever precepts enjoined upon him he is persuaded are true, these must he follow out in his daily life, for only in this way will philosophy be of profit to anyone, if to sound teaching he adds conduct in harmony with it. Lecture 2. That man is born with an inclination towards virtue. All of us, he used to say, are so fashioned by nature that we can live our lives free from error and nobly. Not that one can and another cannot, but all. The clearest evidence of this is the fact that lawgivers lay down for all alike what may be done and forbid what may not be done, exempting from punishment no one who disobeys or does wrong, not the young nor the old, not the strong nor the weak, not anyone whomsoever. And yet if the whole notion of virtue was something that came to us from without, and we shared no part of it by birth, just as in activities pertaining to the other arts no one who has not learned that art is expected to be free from error, so in like manner in things pertaining to the conduct of life, it would not be reasonable to expect anyone to be free from error who had not learned virtue, seeing that virtue is the only thing that saved us from error in daily living. Now in the care of the sick, we demand no one but the physician to be free from error, and in handling the lyre, no one but the musician, and in managing the helm, no one but the pilot. But in the conduct of life, it is no longer only the philosopher whom we expect to be free from error, though he alone would seem to be the only one concerned with the study of virtue, but all men alike, including those who have never given any attention to virtue. Clearly, then, there is no explanation for this other than that the human being is born with an inclination toward virtue. And this indeed is strong evidence of the presence of goodness in our nature, that all speak of themselves as having virtue and being good. For take the common man. When asked whether he is stupid or intelligent, not one will confess to being stupid. Or again, when asked whether he is just or unjust, not one will say he is unjust. In the same way, if one asks him whether he is temperate or intemperate, he replies at once that he is temperate. And finally, if one asks whether he is good or bad, he would say that he is good, even though he can name no teacher of virtue or mention any study or practice of virtue he has ever made. Of what, then, is this evidence, if not of the existence of an innate inclination of the human soul towards goodness and nobleness, and of the presence of the seeds of virtue in each of us. Moreover, because it's entirely to our advantage to be good, some of us deceive ourselves into thinking that we are really good, while others of us are ashamed to admit that we are not. Why then pray when one who has not learned letters or music or gymnastics, never claims to have knowledge of these arts, nor makes any pretense of knowing them, and is quite unable even to name a teacher to whom he went? Why, I say, does everyone profess that he has virtue? It is because none of these other skills is natural to man, and no human is born with a natural faculty for them, whereas an inclination towards virtue is inborn in each one of us. Lecture 2. That man is born with an inclination towards virtue. All of us, he used to say, are so fashioned by nature that we can live our lives free from error and nobly. Not that one can and another cannot, but all. The clearest evidence of this is the fact that lawgivers lay down for all alike what may be done and forbid what may not be done, exempting from punishment no one who disobeys or does wrong, not the young nor the old, not the strong nor the weak, not anyone whomsoever. And yet if the whole notion of virtue was something that came to us from without, and we shared no part of it by birth, just as in activities pertaining to the other arts no one who has not learned that art is expected to be free from error, so in like manner, in things pertaining to the conduct of life, it would not be reasonable to expect anyone to be free from error who had not learned virtue, seeing that virtue is the only thing that saved us from error in daily living. Now in the care of the sick, we demand no one but the physician to be free from error, and in handling the lyre, no one but the musician, and in managing the helm, no one but the pilot. But in the conduct of life, it is no longer only the philosopher whom we expect to be free from error, though he alone would seem to be the only one concerned with the study of virtue, but all men alike, including those who have never given any attention to virtue. Clearly, then, there is no explanation for this other than that the human being is born with an inclination toward virtue. And this indeed is strong evidence of the presence of goodness in our nature, that all speak of themselves as having virtue and being good. For take the common man. When asked whether he is stupid or intelligent, not one will confess to being stupid. Or again, when asked whether he is just or unjust, not one will say he is unjust. In the same way, if one asks him whether he is temperate or intemperate, he replies at once that he is temperate. And finally, if one asks whether he is good or bad, he would say that he is good, even though he can name no teacher of virtue or mention any study or practice of virtue he has ever made. Of what, then, is this evidence, if not of the existence of an innate inclination of the human soul towards goodness and nobleness, and of the presence of the seeds of virtue in each of us? Moreover, because it's entirely to our advantage to be good, some of us deceive ourselves into thinking that we are really good, while others of us are ashamed to admit that we are not. Why then pray when one who has not learned letters or music or gymnastics, never claims to have knowledge of these arts, nor makes any pretense of knowing them, and is quite unable even to name a teacher to whom he went? Why, I say, does everyone profess that he has virtue? It is because none of these other skills is natural to man, and no human is born with a natural faculty for them, whereas an inclination towards virtue is inborn in each one of us. Lecture 3. That women too should study philosophy. When someone asked him if women too should study philosophy, he began to discourse on the theme that they should, in somewhat the following manner. Women, as well as men, he said, have received from the gods the gift of reason, which we use in our dealings with one another, and by which we judge whether a thing is good or bad, right or wrong. Likewise, the female has the same senses as the male, namely sight, hearing, smell, and the others. Also, both have the same parts of the body, and one has nothing more than the other. Moreover, not men alone, but women too, have a natural inclination toward virtue and the capacity for acquiring it, and it is the nature of women no less than men to be pleased by good and just acts, and to reject the opposite of these. If this is true, by what reasoning would it ever be appropriate for men to search out and consider how they may lead good lives, which is exactly the study of philosophy, but inappropriate for women? Could it be that it's fitting for men to be good, but not for women? Let us examine in detail the qualities which are suitable for a woman who would lead a good life, for it will appear that each one of them would accrue to her the most readily from the study of philosophy. In the first place, a woman must be a good housekeeper, that is, a careful accountant of all that pertains to the welfare of her house, and capable of directing the household slaves. It's my contention that these are the very qualities which would be present particularly in the woman who studies philosophy, since obviously each of them is a part of life, and philosophy is nothing other than knowledge about life, and the philosopher, as Socrates said, quoting Homer, is constantly engaged in investigating precisely this. Whatsoever of good and of evil is wrought in thy halls. But above all, a woman must be chaste and self-controlled. She must, be pure in respect of unlawful love, exercise restraint in other pleasures, not be a slave to desire, nor be contentious, not lavish in expense, nor extravagant in dress. Such are the works of a virtuous woman, and to them I would add yet these: to control her temper, not be overcome by grief, and be superior to uncontrolled emotion of every kind. Now these are the things which the teachings of philosophy transmit, and the person who has learnt them and practices them would seem to me to have become a well-ordered and seemly character, whether man or woman. Well then, so much for self-control. As for justice, would not the woman who studies philosophy be just? Would she not be a blameless life partner? Would she not be a sympathetic helpmate? Would she not be an untiring defender of husband and children? And would she not be entirely free of greed and arrogance? And who better than the woman trained in philosophy, and she certainly of necessity, if she has really acquired philosophy, would be disposed to look upon doing a wrong as worse than suffering one, as much worse as it is the baser, and to regard being worsted as better than gaining an unjust advantage? Moreover, who better than she would love her children more than life itself? What woman would be more than just such a one? Now as for courage, certainly it is to be expected that the educated woman will be more courageous than the uneducated, and one who has studied philosophy than one who has not, and she will not therefore submit to anything shameful because of fear of death or unwillingness to face hardship, and she will not be intimidated by anyone because he is of noble birth or powerful or wealthy, no, not even if he be the tyrant of her city. For in fact she has schooled herself to be high-minded, and to think of death not as an evil and life not as good, and likewise not to shun hardship, and never for a moment to seek ease and indolence. So it is that such a woman is likely to be energetic, strong to endure pain, prepared to nourish her children at her own breast, and to serve her husband with her own hands, and willing to do things which some would consider no better than slaves' work. Would not such a woman be a great help to the man who married her, an ornament to her relatives, and a good example for all who know her? Yes, but I assure you, some will say, that women who associate with philosophers are bound to be arrogant for the most part and presumptuous in that abandoning their own households and turning to the company of men they practice speeches, talk like sophists, and analyse syllogisms, when they ought to be sitting at home spinning. I should not expect the women who study philosophy to shirk their appointed tasks for mere talk any more than men, but I maintain that their discussions should be conducted for the sake of their practical application. For as there is no merit in the science of medicine unless it conduces to the healing of man's body, so if a philosopher has or teaches reason, it is of no use if it does not contribute to the virtue of man's soul. Above all, we ought to examine the doctrine which we think women who study philosophy ought to follow. We ought to see if the study which presents modesty as the greatest good can make them presumptuous, if the study which is a guide to the greatest self-restraint accustoms them to live heedlessly, if what sets forth intemperance as the greatest evil does not teach self-control, if what represents the management of a household as a virtue does not impel them to manage well their homes. Finally, the teachings of philosophy exhort the woman to be content with her lot and to work with her own hands. 4. Should daughters receive the same training as sons? Once when the question arose as to whether or not sons and daughters ought to be given the same education, he remarked that trainers of horses and dogs make no distinction in the training of the male and the female. For female dogs are taught to hunt just as the males are, and no one can see no difference in the training of mares, if they are expected to do a horse's work, and the training of stallions. In the case of man, however, it would seem to be felt necessary to employ some special and exceptional training and education for males over females, as if it were not essential that the same virtues should be present in both alike, in man and woman, or as if it were possible to arrive at the same virtues, not through the same, but through different instruction. And yet, that there is not one set of virtues for a man and another for a woman is easy to perceive. In the first place, a man must have understanding, and so must a woman, or what, pray, would be the use of a foolish man or woman? Then it is essential for one no less than the other to live justly, since the man who is not just would not be a good citizen, and the woman would not manage her household well if she did not do it justly. But if she is unjust, she will wrong her husband, like Ariphile in the story. Again, it is recognised as right for a woman in wedlock to be chaste, and so it is likewise for a man. The law, at all events, decrees the same punishment for committing adultery as for being taken in adultery. Gluttony, drunkenness, and other related vices, which are vices of excess and bring disgrace upon those guilty of them, show that self-control is most necessary for every human being, male and female alike. For the only way of escape from wantonness is through self-control. There is no other. Perhaps someone may say that courage is a virtue appropriate to men only. That is not so. For a woman too of the right sort must have courage and be wholly free of cowardice, so that she will neither be swayed by hardships nor by fear. Otherwise, how will she be said to have self-control? If by threat or force she can be constrained to yield to shame. Nay more, it is necessary for women to be able to repel attack, unless indeed they are willing to appear more cowardly than hens and other female birds, which fight with creatures much larger than themselves to defend their young. How then should women not need courage? That women have some prowess in arms the race of the Amazons demonstrated when they defeated many tribes in war. If therefore something of this courage is lacking in other women, it's due to lack of use and practice rather than because they are not endowed with it. If then men and women are born with the same virtues, the same type of training and education must of necessity befit both men and women. For with every animal and plant whatsoever, proper care must be bestowed upon it to produce the excellence appropriate to it. If it not true that if it were man necessary under like circumstances for a man and a woman to be able to play the flute, and if furthermore both had to do so in order to earn a living, we should then give them both exactly the same thorough training in flute playing. And similarly, if it were necessary for either of them to play the harp, well then, if it's necessary for both to be proficient in the virtue which is appropriate to a human being, that is, for both to be able to have understanding and self-control and courage and justice, the one no less than the other, shall we not teach them both alike the art by which a human being becomes good? Yes, certainly we must do that and nothing else. Come now, I suppose someone will say, do you expect that men should learn spinning the same as women, and that women should take part in gymnastic exercises the same as men? No, that I should not demand. But I do say that, since in the human race's constitution is stronger and women's weaker, tasks should be assigned which are suited to the nature of each. That is, the heavier tasks should be given to the stronger and lighter ones to the weaker. Thus, spinning and indoor work would be more fitting for women than for men, while gymnastics and outdoor work would be more suitable for men. Occasionally, however, some men might more fittingly handle certain of the lighter tasks and what is generally considered women's work, and again, women might do heavier tasks which seem more appropriate for men whenever conditions of strength, need or circumstance warranted. For all human tasks, I'm inclined to believe, are a common obligation and are common for men and women, and none is necessarily appointed for either one exclusively, but some pursuits are more suited to the nature of one, some to the other, and for this reason some are called men's work and some women's. But whatever things have reference to virtue, these one would probably say are equally appropriate to the nature of both, inasmuch as we agree that virtues are in no respect more fitting for the one than the other. Hence I hold it reasonable that the things which have reference to virtue ought to be taught to male and female alike, and furthermore, that straight from infancy they ought to be taught that this is right and that is wrong, and that is the same for both alike, that this is helpful, that is harmful, that one must do this, one must not do that. From this training, understanding is developed in those who learn, boys and girls alike, with no difference. Then they must be inspired with a feeling of shame toward all that is base. When these two qualities have been created within them, man and woman are of necessity self-controlled, and most of all the child who is trained properly, whether boy or girl, must be accustomed to endure hardship, not to fear death, not to be disheartened in the face of any misfortune. He must, in short, be accustomed to every situation which calls for courage. Now courage, it was demonstrated above, should be present in women too. Furthermore, to shun selfishness and to have high regard for fairness, and being a human being, to wish to help and to be unwilling to harm one's fellow men is the noblest lesson, and it makes those who learn it just. What reason is there for why it is more appropriate for a man to learn this? Certainly, if it's fitting for women to be just, it's necessary for both to learn the same lessons, which are in the highest degree appropriate to the character of each and supremely important. If it happens that a man knows a little something about a certain skill, and a woman not, or again she knows something and he not, that suggests no difference in the education of either. But about the all-important things, let no one know and the other not, but let them know the same things. If you ask me what doctrine produces such an education, I shall reply that as without philosophy no man would be properly educated, so no woman should be. I do not mean that women should possess technical skill and acuteness in argument. It would be quite superfluous, since they will use philosophy for the ends of their life as women. Even in men, I do not prize this accomplishment too highly. I only urge that they should acquire from philosophy goodness in conduct and nobility of character. Now, in every truth, philosophy is training in nobility of character and nothing else. Lecture 5. Which is more effective, theory or practice? At another time, the problem arose among us whether for the acquisition of virtue practice or theory is more effective. Understanding that theory teaches what is right conduct, while practice represents the habit of those accustomed to act in accordance with such theory. To Musonius, practice seemed to be more effective, and speaking in support of his opinion, he asked one of those present the following question. Suppose that there are two brilliant physicians, one able to discourse very brilliantly about the art of medicine, but having no experience in taking care of the sick, and the other quite incapable of speaking, but experienced in treating his patients according to correct medical theory. Which one, he asked, would you choose to attend, you, if you were ill? He replied that he would choose the doctor who had experience in healing. Musonius then continued, well then, let us take another example of two men. One has sailed a great deal and served as pilot on many boats. The other one has sailed very little and has never acted as pilot. If the one who had never piloted a ship should speak most ably on the methods of navigation, and the other very poorly and ineffectively, which one would you employ as pilot if you were going on a voyage? The man said he would take the experienced pilot. Again, Musonius said, take the case of two musicians. One knows the theory of music and discourses on it most convincingly, but is unable to sing or play the harp or the lyre. The other is inferior in theory, but is proficient in playing the harp and the lyre, and in singing as well. To which one would you give a position as musician? Or which one would you like to have as teacher for a child who does not know music? The man answered that he would choose the one who was skilled in practice. Well then, said Musonius, that being the case, in the matter of temperance and self-control, is it not much better to be self-controlled and temperate in all one's actions than to be able to say that what one ought to do? Here too the young man agreed that it is of less significance and importance to speak well about self-control than to practice self-control. Thereupon, Musonius, drawing together what had been said, asked how now, in view of these conclusions, could the knowledge of the theory of anything be better than becoming accustomed to act according to the principles of the theory, if we understand that application enables one to act, but theory makes one capable of speaking it. Theory, which teaches one how should act, is related to application and comes first, since it's not possible to do anything really well unless its practical execution be in harmony with theory. In effectiveness, however, practice takes precedence over theory as being more influential in leading men to action.